Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, July 31st, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the swing state tour that Vice President Kamala Harris has planned over the coming days ahead of the Democratic National Convention, which is set to take place in just under 20 days. This decision to visit 7 battleground states across a 1-week time frame, likely with her vice presidential contender, marks a change in campaign style from the Democratic Party, unlike anything we had ever seen with President Biden, even dating back to the 2020 presidential election. Kamala Harris now being the presumptive nominee for the Democratic Party with a lot of enthusiasm and backing on her end, as we saw in an Atlanta rally last night. If you haven't watched it, I encourage you to do so to give you a better understanding of the modern-day Democratic Party and the post-Biden era of campaigning for Vice President Harris. Now, this decision, I think, also just signals that Kamala Harris is, in fact, honing in on 7 key and crucial battleground states, and while I won't use the term ignoring the others, not putting as much focus on them as the Biden campaign did back in 2020. I'm often reminded that the Democratic Party back in 2020 saw a far bigger pathway to 270, a larger amount of electoral votes that they could have won in the 2020 presidential election against President Trump. At the time, Vice President Biden was very confident that he could do well in these battleground states, that he could flip states that had historically been very Republican, and so he did. He won in states like Arizona and Georgia, which in the last time those states voted blue respectively was in 1996 and in 1992. So clearly the Biden coalition of the 2020 election did in fact bring in some historically Republican states, but their map excited the base because they were looking much further than just the 306 electoral votes that they ended up winning. And so they invested in a lot of battleground states that ultimately ended up shifting very minimally relative to the last election. Democrats spent over $100 million combined in Iowa and Ohio across a multitude of races there, only for those states to vote exactly how they did in the last election. Democrats spent over $100 million for Biden to win in Florida, only for the state to shift to the right relative to 2020. And Democrats saw an expansive map here with Ohio, Iowa, Florida, North Carolina, even some circumstance expanding into states like Texas, which ultimately ended up voting for President Trump by 5.6%. What we find here on our 2020 electoral map is that what the Biden campaign was hoping for actually did not end up coming through on Election Day, besides the eventual victory through 3 Rust Belt states and Arizona and Georgia. But Kamala Harris seems to have her sights set on far fewer states than the Biden campaign thought they could win back in 2020. It's a sign that Democratic leadership and those closest to the vice president genuinely know what they're doing in this election cycle. And that isn't to say that Democrats didn't know what they were doing back in 2020. But in a time where President Trump's approval rating was lower than 50% in over half of the country, his approval rating was at 38% when Joe Biden decided he was going to run for president back in April of 2019, the numbers there were conducive, in theory, to a very strong Democratic victory. But what we have found is that Donald Trump has a uniquely strong electability factor that many Democrats really don't understand. But this time, they genuinely seem to do. When I say that, I mean it earnestly. The Kamala Harris campaign has seen an influx over $200 million in the past week alone. They've also found that over 100,000 new people across battleground states want to sign up and volunteer for Vice President Harris. She is filling up stadiums. She is filling up audiences that President Biden could not even rival back in 2020 or in 2024 in a post-COVID era. We are talking about an entirely new, dramatic style of campaigning, and one that Kamala Harris, visiting these battleground states, will only continue to boost the momentum that she has seen in these same battleground states. As a new Morning Consult and Bloomberg poll shows Kamala Harris gaining ground on Trump in 6 of the 7 main swing states. You'll know which ones in just a moment based on the states she is deciding to visit, and is winning in the majority of them, in a complete change in direction from the Biden-Harris campaign that is now the Harris, whoever she chooses as VP campaign, a decision and a change in this style that is going to do tremendously well for the Democratic Party if these numbers and momentum maintains itself through the election. Now, the states that Kamala Harris is going to visit, announced by Politico this morning, are the 7 crucial battleground states. I have a map up here for you so we can visualize just how many votes she is vying for and what states she's focusing on and what regions and everything that comes with that. She's going to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which many sources close to the vice president seem to indicate this is her first stop with her VP nominee. So she's going to be going here. She's going to be focusing on, who her announcement's going to be right before the convention, all this excitement in Philadelphia, a region the Democrats need to do well in. Pennsylvania is going to be a main focus of this campaign. But then she's going to western Wisconsin, which is actually a bit further away from Milwaukee, farther away from Milwaukee, probably, the furthest you can get in the state. But the focus there seems to be bringing in a larger base. There's swing counties out there. There's populous counties out there. She's going to western Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, to Wisconsin, then Detroit, Michigan, another region of the country and a region of the state she needs to do very well in. Then she's down to Raleigh, North Carolina. Then she's to Savannah, Georgia. Then she's to Phoenix, Arizona. Then she's to Las Vegas, Nevada. This is a 7-day schedule, state to state to state to state. It's exhausting to say because it's exhausting to do, but impressive nonetheless. This is a decision, again, that completely rivals what the Biden-Harris campaign had done. President Biden would do campaign stints 2 to 3 times a week maximum. Obviously, very different responsibilities, very different circumstances. He's the president of the United States. He has far more cut out for him than the vice president of the United States by the nature of the role that he is in. At the same time, it's no secret that President Biden does not have as much campaign stamina as Kamala Harris, that she's younger, that she has a base that is more riled up, and the audiences, and I will say to this point, audiences filling up an arena, audiences filling up a stadium is what the Kamala Harris campaign wants. It's not a good look if President Biden was out in Detroit, Michigan, and sure, he had a packed room. But a packed room under the Biden-Harris campaign was 3,000, the largest we ever saw in this set of campaigns. It was nothing like what we saw under Donald Trump, and I get it. Enthusiastic voters is the same as unenthusiastic voters. But getting people out to vote is where enthusiasm really, really matters. And for Kamala Harris, filling up that stadium last night in Atlanta, where 10,000 people had to be turned away because they reached event capacity within the first hour, is absolutely a sign of a change in perspective on this race and a change in the way voters are interacting with a presidential candidate like Kamala Harris in a way they did not with President Biden. And so in these states, again, Las Vegas, Nevada, Phoenix, Arizona, I'm going to forget some of these areas here, Savannah, Georgia, love that city there. Savannah, Georgia, very big part of the state that Kamala Harris has visited ATL. She's been to Fulton County. She's been to DeKalb, right? DeKalb. You're talking about a portion of the state right down here that Kamala Harris needs a vote dump, right? A huge, huge, huge amount of Democratic vote there to say that, while the rest of the state, you can find a lot of the outside counties with far less populations. It's a sea of red and very, very big blue pockets that have larger populations. I mean, that's how cities work. That's how voting works. But you can start to see here exactly where she's making a campaign. Nevada, it makes a lot of sense. Arizona makes a lot of sense to focus in on these big states. But it's not like Phoenix is the Atlanta of Georgia, right? Or Atlanta of Arizona. Atlanta of Arizona, you cannot compare Atlanta and Phoenix in terms of voting power. You cannot compare Las Vegas and Atlanta in terms of voting power for their state because 90% of the state's population comes in that metro area in Arizona and Nevada. The same cannot be said about Georgia. Again, another indication that the Kamala Harris campaign knows what they're doing in terms of how they're campaigning in these states. Western Wisconsin, same case to be made there. Detroit, Michigan, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Raleigh, North Carolina. She is making a play for these 7 battleground states, likely with her VP contender, unless that somehow changes, because she needs to announce in around a week from now. The law requires in Ohio that she announces by August 7th, and Democrats have made it very clear they are trying to play it safe. They are trying to play it safe in this process. But 93 electoral votes being played for. And the reason why this matters so incredibly much is, as a reminder, these are the same 7 battleground states that Kamala Harris should solely and only be focusing on with her war chest of $200 million. Why? Because if we were just to add in, those Democratic states, let's go ahead and just throw in another new candidate here. We can just assume that this is for Vice President Harris. If you were just to take the states that Joe Biden won in the last election by 5 points or more, you'd end up with a map like this one. Colorado, New Mexico, Illinois, Minnesota, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine at large, Maine's first, Washington, D.C., and Virginia. That alone, and Nebraska second, actually, and don't forget about Hawaii. That alone brings Kamala Harris 226 new electoral votes combined with the 93 that she brings in. You're talking about a total 319 electoral votes. 319 electoral votes in this circumstance. That matters. That is a big deal. These 7 battleground states, and I know Democrats in a perfect scenario would love Florida to be competitive again, Ohio to be competitive again, Iowa to be competitive again, and for Democrats to fight for Texas. But the Kamala Harris for President campaign is aware, and I'm not saying that they won't visit Ohio, they won't visit Iowa, they won't visit Florida, they won't visit Texas. There is a tremendous benefit of a presidential campaign focusing on areas of this country that may not typically get as much attention from a nationalized campaign to benefit down ballot elections, state legislative elections, state attorney general races, governor races, Senate races, House races, whatever it might be, there is a benefit. However, when you talk about the states that are of the utmost importance to winning an election, it comes down to these core 7. It's a huge change, not only in direction from the Biden 2020 campaign, but the Trump 2024 campaign. Let's go ahead and throw in a bit of red here to understand where Donald Trump is campaigning this cycle. Sure, the numbers against President Biden were pretty strong for Donald Trump, but not strong enough to justify the campaign strategy that he has exhibited and has shown he will invest in these states. Let me show you. He's focusing on the same states as Kamala Harris, which I think is commendable to an extent, right? You're talking about him focusing on the same 7 states that Kamala Harris is too. But it doesn't just extend there. Keep in mind that Kamala Harris has more money on hand than Donald Trump. Keep in mind that Kamala Harris has swung the polls in a way that Donald Trump has not. Keep in mind that the momentum is on Kamala Harris's side, and so is the media narrative. But let's get back to this. Donald Trump is focusing on these 7 states. But it doesn't just end there. He's made every indication that he is now investing in Virginia and Minnesota, that he's investing in states like New Hampshire and New Jersey, that he may be investing in states like New York, where he held a rally in the Bronx. He also seems to indicate, based on people closest to him, that they believe they can now win states like New Mexico and Colorado. And of course, he's going for Nebraska's second, which brings us to a whopping 178 electoral votes. Now, my problem with this isn't that Donald Trump can't win any of these states, because he certainly will win at least one of these states, at least one of these states that are characterized in red, in my personal opinion, because this election, I do think, today is closer than it was in 2020. But at the same time, when an election does come down to the narrowest and narrowest of margins, if I was reflecting, and I'm not, right, because I'm not, Kamala Harris's campaign manager, but if I was reflecting on an electoral map like this one, and I saw that Wisconsin was won by just, 20,000 votes, half a percentage point divided Joe Biden and Donald Trump in a must-win state for Joe Biden, I would have wondered, why in the world did we spend $100 million in Iowa for the state to only shift 1 point to the left? Why did we spend $100 million in Ohio for the state to shift 0.1% to the left? Questions that can be answered in the simplest of terms. These states have become too far out of reach for Democrats, and although historically we went for them, now is not the time. That's what the Kamala Harris campaign has realized, that these 7 states are the pathway to victory. And we're seeing her doing well, surging in enthusiasm, gaining in these battleground states. Why? That's where they're investing. That's where they're visiting. That's what their focus is. It's a focus that seems to be so exceptionally clear that their main goal is winning the presidency and not necessarily a slam dunk against Donald Trump, because winning the presidency will serve to do exactly that. The Donald Trump campaign wants to do a slam dunk on Kamala Harris, but may entirely miss the net. Why? Because they're spread too thin. 19 field offices, they announced, opening up in Virginia and Minnesota. 19 field offices. 19 field offices. Up until months ago, they had 0 in Pennsylvania, 0 in Michigan, 0 in Wisconsin, 0 in Arizona. At the time they made this announcement, less than 20 in battleground states. Now, of course, they've ramped up their efforts. But for what in New Jersey? But for what in Virginia? I hate to say it, But as much as the polls might indicate the races are narrowing in these states, they still almost always have Joe Biden at the time, and now certainly Kamala Harris on top. Think about the decision to open up field offices in Minnesota, yet new polling from the state's top pollster in Minnesota shows Kamala Harris ahead by 10. By 10, that's 3 points ahead of where Biden was in 2020. And yet, all of a sudden, Trump thinks he's going to win it. Newsflash, he's not. And if the race does come down to the narrowest of margins, the way it did back in 2020, and Donald Trump loses the election, I can't help but think, and I'm talking about this perspective in the future, I wouldn't help but thinking, I probably didn't say that correctly. Point being, let me get past that point, that this was a decision that could have been, or a result that could have been curtailed had they invested their money the way that Kamala Harris's campaign is. And we're also saying that although some of the numbers may be that she is slipping in safe Democratic states, I can guarantee you one thing. If Kamala Harris wins New York by 5 points less than Joe Biden did in 2020 but wins the election, everyone will sleep at night on the Democratic side. Nobody will be worried about, what that 5 points meant for New York. Even if Kamala Harris loses the popular vote but wins the Electoral College, which I think is far unlikely at this point, far more unlikely than it was under Biden, that will be something that, sure, might not speak to a massive electoral mandate, but they still won the election. They can yell scoreboard at the Donald Trump campaign while they're focused on the popular vote in a way that they weren't back in 2016. And I can guarantee you that would absolutely happen. So in this decision for the Kamala Harris for President campaign, doing this massive, massive, massive swing state tour in just under a week speaks to a level of campaigning we have not seen in Democratic politics since before Hillary Clinton. It's a massive change in our direction. It's a massive change in our collective understanding of this race, and we'll likely see that Harris and Trump will go tit for tat in terms of performances, in terms of, appearances. Very, very different campaign than what we saw back in 2020 in the era of COVID-19, in the era of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. This is an entirely new election, and Kamala Harris's new rally schedule, likely with her VP, shows a clear directive as to how they win this election. Unlike what we saw with Biden back in 2020, a much more narrow, focused one, and one that can really hone in on these battleground states and win Kamala Harris this election. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord, top left of the screen. I keep forgetting. Top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2020 taking a step back, 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Sorry for messing up here. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.